El día en que Daniel Kaminsky comenzó a sufrir la peor pesadilla de su vida y al mismo tiempo a tener los primeros atisbos de su privilegiada fortuna, un envolvente olor a mar y un silencio intempestivo, casi sólido, se cernía sobre la madrugada habanera. Su tío Joseph lo había despertado mucho más temprano de la hora en que solía hacerlo para enviarlo al colegio hebreo del centro israelita, donde ya el niño recibía instrucción académica y religiosa, más las indispensables lecciones de lengua española que le permitirían su inserción en el mundo abigarrado y variopinto donde viviría, solo sabía el Santísimo por cuánto tiempo. Pero el día comenzó a revelarse diferente cuando, luego de darle la bendición del Shabbat y la congratulación por el Shabbat, el tío rompió su mesura habitual y depositó un beso en la frente del muchacho. El tío Joseph, también Kaminsky, por supuesto polaco, para aquel entonces llamado por quienes lo trataban como Pepe Cartera, gracias a la maestría con la cual desempeñaba su oficio de fabricante de bolsos, billeteras, carteras, entre otros artículos de piel, siempre había sido, y lo sería hasta su muerte, un estricto cumplidor de los preceptos de la fe judaica. Por ello, antes de permitirle probar el anticipado desayuno ya dispuesto sobre la mesa, le recordó al muchacho que debía hacer no solo las abluciones y los rezos habituales de una mañana muy especial, pues había querido la gracia del Santísimo, bendito sea Él, que cayera en Shabbat la celebración del Shabbat, la milenaria fiesta mayor consagrada a recordar la entrega de los 10 mandamientos al patriarca Moisés y la jubilosa aceptación de la Torá por parte de los fundadores de la nación. Porque esa madrugada, como le recordó el tío en su discurso, también debían elevar otras muchas plegarias a su Dios para que su divina intercesión los ayudara a solucionar del mejor modo lo que, de momento, parecía verse complicado de la peor manera, aunque tal vez las complicaciones no los alcanzaran a ellos, añadió y sonrió con picardía. Tras casi una hora de rezos durante la cual Daniel creyó que desfallecería de hambre y sueño, Joseph Kaminsky le indicó al fin que podía servirse del abundante desayuno en el cual se sucedieron la leche tibia de cabra que, por ser sábado, la italiana María Perupato, apostólica y romana, y por tal condición escogida por el tío como Goy del Shabbat, les había colocado sobre los carbones ardientes de su anafe. Las galletas cuadradas llamadas matzot, confituras de fruta y hasta una buena ración de baklava, rebosante de miel, un banquete que le haría preguntarse al niño de dónde habría sacado el tío el dinero para tales lujos. Porque de aquellos años Daniel Kaminsky recordaría, para el resto de su larga presencia en la tierra, además de los tormentos que le regalaban los ruidos del ambiente y la semana horrible que viviría desde aquel instante, el hambre insaciable e insaciada que siempre lo perseguía como el más fiel de los perros. Inusual y opíparamente desayunado, el muchacho había aprovechado la dilatada estancia de su estreñido tío en los baños colectivos del falansterio donde vivían para subir a la azotea del edificio. La loza todavía estaba fresca, a aquellas horas previas a la salida del sol, y, desafiando las prohibiciones, se atrevió a asomarse al alero para contemplar el panorama de las calles Compostela y Acosta, donde había ido a situarse el corazón de la cada vez más crecida judería habanera. El siempre abarrotado ministerio del edificio del Ministerio de Gobernación, un antiguo convento católico de los tiempos coloniales, permanecía cerrado a cal y canto como si estuviera muerto. Por la arcada contigua bajo la cual discurría la calle Acosta y formaba el llamado Arco de Belén, no transitaba nada ni nadie. El cine ideal, la panadería de los alemanes, la ferretería de los polacos, el restaurante Moshe Pipik, que el apetito del niño siempre observaba como la mayor tentación reinante en la tierra, tenían sus cortinas bajadas, las luces de los escaparates apagadas. Aunque en los alrededores vivían muchos judíos y, por tanto, la mayoría de aquellos negocios eran de judíos y en algunos casos permanecían cerrados los sábados, la quietud imperante no se debía solo a la hora o a que estuvieran en Shabbat, día de Shabbat, jornada de sinagoga, sino al hecho de que en ese instante, mientras los cubanos dormían a pierna suelta el feriado pascual, la mayoría de los askenazíes y sefardíes de la zona escogían sus mejores ropas y se preparaban para salir a la calle con las mismas intenciones que los Kaminsky.
Hello, I'm Anna Kushner, and I am going to read from Heretics, which I had the pleasure of translating, the same passage that Leonardo just read to you in Spanish. And this is the opening of the novel. Havana, 1939. It would take Daniel Kaminsky many years to grow accustomed to the exuberant sounds of a city built on the most unwieldy commotion. He had quickly discovered that everything there began and ended with yelling. Everything sputtered with rust and humidity. Cars moved forward amid the wheezing and banging of engines or the long beeping of horns. Dogs barked with and without reason, and roosters even crowed at midnight, while each vendor made himself known with a toot, a bell, a trumpet, a whistle, a rattle, a flageolet, a melody in perfect pitch, or simply a shriek. He had run around in a city in which, on top of it all, each night at 9 on the dot, cannon fire roared without any declaration of war or city gates to close, and where, in good times and bad, you always, always heard music, and not just that, singing. At the beginning of his Havana life, the boy would often try to evoke as much as his scarcely filled with memories mind would allow, the thick silences of the Jewish bourgeois neighborhood in Krakow, where he had been born and lived his early days. He pursued that cold, rose-colored land of the past intuitively from the depths of his rootlessness. But when his memories, real or imagined, touched down on the firm ground of reality, he immediately reacted and tried to escape it. In the dark, silent Krakow of his infancy, too much noise could mean only two things. It was either market day or there was some imminent danger. In the final years of his Polish existence, danger grew to be more common than merchants, so fear became a constant companion. As expected, when Daniel Kaminsky landed in the raucous city, for a long time he would process the pounding of that explosive, resounding environment, one alarm bell after another, until, with the passing of years, he managed to understand that in this new world, silence tended to herald only the most dangerous things. Once he overcame that phase, when he finally came to live amid the noise without hearing the noise, the way one breathes without consciousness of each breath, young Daniel discovered that he had lost his ability to appreciate the beneficent qualities of silence. But he would boast, above all, of having managed to make peace with Havana's racket, since, at the same time, he'd attained the stubborn goal of feeling like he belonged to that turbulent city where, lucky for him, he had been spit out by the wave of a curse of history or of the divine, and until the end of his days, he would wonder which of these was more accurate. The day on which Daniel Kaminsky began to experience the worst nightmare of his life and simultaneously to get the first hint of his privileged fate, an overwhelming ocean smell and an ungodly, almost physical silence hung over Havana in the wee hours of the morning. His uncle Joseph had woken him earlier than he usually did to send him to Hebrew school at the Israelite Center, where the boy was receiving academic and religious instruction, in addition to the essential Spanish language lessons that would allow for his integration into the motley and diverse world where he would live only God knew for how long. But the day revealed itself as different when, after having imparted the Sabbath blessing and expressed his best wishes for Shavuot, his uncle broke with his usual restraint and kissed the boy on the forehead. Uncle Joseph, also a Kaminsky and of course also Polish, had by then taken to being called Pepe the Purseman, thanks to the masterful way he carried out his work as a maker of bags, billfolds, and purses, among other leather goods, and was always, and would be until his death, a strict follower of the precepts of the Jewish religion. As such, before letting him taste the awaited breakfast already laid out on the table, he reminded the boy that they should not merely do the customary ablutions and prayers of a very special morning, since it was God's will, blessed be, that Shavuot, the great ancient festival commemorating the giving of the Ten Commandments to the patriarch Moses and the joyous acceptance of the Torah by the nation's founders, fell on the Sabbath. They should also offer up prayers to their God that morning, as his uncle reminded him in his speech, asking for his divine intervention in helping them resolve in the best possible way something that seemed to have become complicated in the worst way. Although the complications may not apply to them, he added, smiling mischievously. After almost an hour of prayers, during which Daniel thought he would faint from hunger and fatigue, Joseph Kaminsky finally signaled that his nephew could help himself to the abundant breakfast featuring warm goat's milk, which, since it was Saturday, the Roman and apostolic Maria Perupato, an Italian woman chosen by his uncle as the Sabbath goy, had left on the burning coals of their portable cooker. The square crackers called matzah, fruit jams, and even a fair amount of baklava dripping in honey. The feast would make the boy ask himself where his uncle found the money for such luxuries, since what Daniel Kaminsky would always remember of those days for the rest of his long years on earth, besides the torment caused by the surrounding noise and the horrible week that followed, was the insatiable and unending hunger that nagged at him like the most loyal dog. Filled with such a sumptuous and unusual breakfast, the boy took advantage of his constipated uncle's delayed trip to the communal bathroom of the phalanstery where they lived to go up to the building's rooftop. The tile was still wet with dew in those hours prior to sunrise, and, defying all prohibitions, he dared to lean over the eaves to contemplate the panorama of Compostela and Acosta streets, the heart of Havana's growing Jewish population. The unkempt Ministry of the Interior building, an old Catholic convent from the colonial era, remained closed under lock and key as if it were dead. Under the contiguous arcade, the so-called Arco de Belén, below which Calle Acosta ran, not a single being walked. Ideal Movie Theater, the German bakery, the Polish hardware store, Moshe Pipik's restaurant, which the boy's appetite considered the world's greatest temptation, all had their curtains drawn and darkened windows. Although many Jews lived around there, and as such, the majority of the businesses were Jewish-run and in some cases remained closed every Saturday, the reigning calm was not only due to the hour or to the fact that it was the Sabbath, Shavuot day, synagogue day, but also because, at that instant, while Cubans slept the day away, the majority of the area's Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews were picking out their best clothes and getting ready to go out with the same purpose as the Kaminskys.
Great. Thank you both for that. It's such a pleasure to hear Leonardo read it in the original Spanish and Anna to read it in English. I think it's important to recall at a gathering like this, when we talk about writers of the Caribbean, that writers of the Caribbean, of course, are not just writing in English, writing in Spanish, writing in French, Dutch as well. So it's wonderful to actually hear that language read up here. I also love that beginning of Heretics, that description of Havana as soundscape. It's about Jewry, it's about art history, it's about contemporary Cuba. But I wonder if you could just talk to us about the genesis of this book, how it came about.
Esta es una novela en la que aparece mi personaje fetiche, mi compañero de la vida, el investigador Mario Conde, pero no es el protagonista de la historia.
This is a novel in which my fetishistic, lifelong companion, Mario Conde, appears, but is not the main character of the novel.
Porque yo quería escribir en esta novela algo que escapara de las lecturas, de las posibles lecturas directas de una o de varias realidades.
I wanted to write something that would be able to escape one single or possible readings of it.
La semilla, ese momento extraño en el que uno encuentra una idea que piensa que se puede convertir en una novela.
The seed, that strange moment when you find something that you think could become a novel,
Era la historia de una persona joven en la Cuba contemporánea que de alguna forma trataba de practicar su libertad individual.
was the story of a young person in modern Cuba who was trying to exercise their own personal freedom.
Yo acababa de escribir El hombre que amaba a los perros, una novela donde inevitablemente los contenidos políticos estaban presentes por la propia esencia de la trama.
I had just finished writing The Man Who Loved Dogs, a novel that, because of its very nature, contained a lot about politics.
Y si hablaba de un joven en Cuba y sus pretensiones de ejercer su libertad, pues eso podía tener una lectura política directa.
So if I then talked about a young person who was trying to exercise his own freedoms, that would have a very obvious political reading.
Y yo quería ir más allá porque la búsqueda de la libertad no solamente se concreta, la libertad individual no solamente se concreta en condiciones o en términos políticos.
And I wanted to go beyond that because the search for your own freedom isn't just something that can be spoken of in political terms.
Lo que sí quería era, igual que en El hombre que amaba a los perros, que toda esta reflexión partiera de Cuba y llegara a Cuba, partiera de mí y llegara a mí.
What I did want was for all of this to begin and end with Cuba, to begin and end with me.
Y cuando empecé a tratar de trabajar esta novela, me encontré con una esencia filosófica del judaísmo que es la práctica del libre albedrío.
So when I began to work on this novel, I came up against an essential philosophy of Judaism, which is the exercise of free will.
Que es, como todos sabemos, esa enorme discusión de hasta qué punto el hombre es completamente responsable de sus actos o sus actos ya están predestinados por una decisión divina.
Which is that enormous debate over to what degree man is responsible for his own fate or to what degree that fate is predestined.
Y a partir de esa idea, pues, como ocurre cuando uno está escribiendo una novela o quiere escribir una novela, pues me tropecé con un acontecimiento histórico de los más peculiares de la historia cubana.
So with that idea in mind, I then came upon this historic incident, a very peculiar historic incident in Cuban history.
Es un acontecimiento que muchas personas conocen, la llegada de un barco de pasajeros llamado San Luis a Cuba, que no recibe permiso, cargado de judíos, 900 judíos, y que no recibe el permiso para desembarcar en Cuba, ni en los Estados Unidos, ni en Canadá.
And this historic event is the arrival of a passenger ship in Cuba by the name of the St. Louis, which had aboard 900 Jews fleeing Europe at the time, which was not given permission to dock in Cuba or in the United States.
Es uno de los episodios más lamentables y más tristes de la historia política cubana con respecto a la emigración.
It's one of the most regrettable and one of the saddest incidents in the history of Cuba dealing with immigration.
Porque Cuba siempre fue un país abierto a la emigración, fue un país que se hizo con emigrantes.
Because Cuba had traditionally been a country that was very open to immigration, and it's in fact a country that was made by immigrants.
Casualmente, igual que los Estados Unidos.
Incidentally, just like the United States.
Y el rechazo de estas personas que prácticamente con ese rechazo fueron condenados a morir en el Holocausto, el 60% de esas personas murieron en el Holocausto.
And the rejection of these people, the rejection of which was practically a death sentence, since about 60% or so of these people did end up dying in the Holocaust.
Es un acontecimiento terrible por el cual ningún gobierno de Cuba nunca ha expresado una disculpa.
It's a terrible event that no government in Cuba ever, nobody ever in power in Cuba has ever expressed any regret over or formally apologized for.
Lo curioso es que Cuba era un paraíso para los judíos que venían huyendo de Europa, muchos de los cuales se asentaron en Cuba o de Cuba vinieron a vivir acá a los Estados Unidos o a Argentina, que fueron los dos países que capitalizaron en el siglo XX la emigración judía europea.
What's curious about this is that Cuba was actually a paradise for the Jews who had fled Europe and established businesses there. And along with Argentina, it was one of the two main centers, along with later the United States, where Jews had arrived and become prosperous.
Y encontrando que en Cuba estos judíos, me estoy alejando un poquito de la esencia de la pregunta, pero es que me parece que es interesante y además apropiado en los tiempos que estamos viviendo a nivel global esta reflexión sobre la emigración.
So I'm veering a little bit from the question, but I find it interesting to reflect on these matters given the global moment that we're living with respect to immigration.
Estos judíos en Cuba encontraron un espacio de realización individual, comercial, religiosa enorme.
These Jewish people who arrived in Cuba, they found a space for themselves, for self-fulfillment in terms of business, in terms of creativity, in terms of participation in public life.
Según muchos de ellos, incluso habían encontrado uno de los posibles paraísos en la tierra.
And according to some, had even found one of the possible sites of paradise on earth.
Y tan es así que cuando después del año 59, muchos de estos judíos que tenían pequeños negocios salen de Cuba temerosos de lo que podía ocurrir con un gobierno comunista, vienen a vivir la mayoría en la zona de Miami, especialmente en Miami Beach.
So after 1959, many of these Jewish families who prospered in Cuba left out of fear for what the communist influence would have on their prosperity, and came to settle here in the United States, specifically in Miami Beach.
Y todavía hoy se hacen llamar Cubans, es decir, judíos cubanos, y en su sinagoga hay 3 banderas.
And to this day, they still call themselves Cubans, Jewish Cubans, and in their synagogues in Miami Beach, they fly 3 flags.
La bandera de los Estados Unidos, el país donde están viviendo, por supuesto, la bandera de Israel, la patria ancestral, y la bandera cubana.
So the flag of the United States, where they live currently, the Cuban flag, the country that they left, and the Israeli flag of their ancestors.
Una bandera cubana en una sinagoga judía de Miami Beach es tan normal como una bandera cubana en el San Carlos. Es lo mismo.
To see a Cuban flag in a synagogue in Miami Beach is as normal as seeing the Cuban flag flying at the San Carlos.
Y por ese camino me encontré el otro gran momento de libertad de los judíos, de capacidad y posibilidad de realización, que fue la Ámsterdam del siglo XVII, justamente en la época en que vivió y pintó Rembrandt.
And in doing my research on this, that's how I came across the other great moment of Jewish prosperity, of diaspora prosperity, which was in 17th century Amsterdam, and the story specifically of Rembrandt.
Bueno, todas esas historias están conectadas a través de la presencia o las pesquisas del personaje de Mario Conde.
And all of those stories are interconnected in my novel through the character of Mario Conde.
Y tienen que ver a veces en un nivel más filosófico, a veces de una manera más directa, con lo que es la vida cotidiana o lo que es, desde mi punto de vista, la vida cotidiana en Cuba.
And they all have to do either philosophically or more directly with what constitutes Cuban daily life.
Yo he tratado a lo largo de mis años de trabajo como novelista de hacer de alguna forma una crónica de la vida contemporánea cubana.
Through my years as a novelist, I've tried to chronicle modern Cuban life.
Porque creo que, sobre todo desde la perspectiva de mi generación, es una experiencia bastante singular.
Because I think that from the perspective of my generation in particular, it's a very singular experience.
Y lo he hecho con las novelas que he escrito, lo hago con la novela que dentro de 3 días saldrá a las librerías en España.
I've done it with the novels I've already written, including the novel I have coming out in Spanish in just 3 days.
Y creo que lo voy a hacer en la novela que voy a comenzar a escribir, que pasará por distintos escenarios de distintas partes del mundo.
And I believe that I will do this with the novel I'm about to begin writing that goes through various different geographic parts of the world.
Y en ese recorrido pasará nada más y nada menos que por la Hialeah de los cubanos.
And that journey, I'll also be stopping in no place other than Hialeah, the Mecca of the Cubans now.
Great. I'm going to condense this question. I'm going to condense 3 into 1. How about that? Because I wanted to ask Anna a question as well. But Leonardo wrote an essay a few years ago, if I'm getting the title right, Some Days I Wish I Were Paul Auster. And the idea, which in and of itself is great, but the idea of that piece in part was that, of course, at gatherings like this, or the ways in which your work is often talked about, people just want to talk about politics. It's what they do when Cuba comes up. As we've just seen, it's impossible to talk about culture, history, the writing you do without politics coming into it. But I wonder if you could just talk to us about 2 things. One, just the experience of publishing in Cuba these days, a book like this, which comes out in a small edition, but then you, of course, are published internationally. And so I wonder if you could just contrast being published in Cuba to being published internationally in the US by Forrest Strauss and by others elsewhere. And I wonder if you could talk to us about your process of working together and translating.
Sí. El título de la conversación que estamos teniendo hoy, yo había propuesto que era Escribir en Cuba en el siglo XXI.
So the subject I had proposed for this talk today was writing in Cuba in the 21st century.
Porque yo he escrito un texto, un artículo, un pequeño ensayo con ese título.
Because I wrote a small essay with the same title.
Y yo digo en algún momento que ser escritor en Cuba en esta época del siglo XXI es casi un acto de fe.
And in that essay, I say that being a writer in Cuba today is practically an act of faith.
La industria editorial cubana es una industria editorial que se empobreció y no se ha recuperado en sus cantidades y calidades de publicaciones.
The publishing industry in Cuba is one that the quality of which has greatly become impoverished, and it has yet to recover its quality and quantity.
La promoción de los escritores no es una promoción organizada, no es una promoción realmente impulsada por las instituciones.
The promotion of writers is not something that's truly pushed by the institutions themselves.
Y, por ejemplo, un escritor en Cuba que dedica 3 años a escribir una novela y la publica con una editorial cubana,
So, for example, a writer who spends 3 years working on a book in Cuba and publishes it with a Cuban publishing house
recibe unos derechos de autor que son equivalentes a $250.
receives the equivalent of author's rights totaling about $250.
Estar 3 años escribiendo una novela para ganar $250 solamente lo hace alguien que tenga mucha fe en el Señor.
So somebody who's willing to spend 3 years working on a book to then only receive $250 is someone who has to have great faith in the Lord.
Pero la gente escribe y la gente trata de publicar sus libros.
And yet, people write and they try to publish their books.
En Cuba siempre ha habido una enorme cantidad de poetas. Los poetas en Cuba se dan como las hierbas silvestres.
In Cuba, there has always been a great quantity of poets. They're almost like weeds.
Y también hay cuentistas, novelistas, dramaturgos que escriben y trabajan en Cuba.
And you also have short story writers, novelists, playwrights who live and work in Cuba.
Y en general, esa literatura es una de las formas de expresión de la sociedad cubana contemporánea.
And in general, all of these writings are a form of the expression of modern Cuban society.
El problema es cómo hacer llegar a los lectores esa reflexión, esa mirada desde el arte sobre la sociedad, sobre la realidad, sobre los sueños de las personas.
The problem is making those reflections about their dreams, about reality, reach the readers.
Realmente somos pocos escritores cubanos que vivimos en Cuba los que tenemos la suerte de tener editoriales seguras fuera de la isla.
There are really very few of us writing in Cuba today who have the luck of having access to publishing houses outside of Cuba.
Y cuando los libros se publican en Cuba, las ediciones son pequeñas, a veces mal distribuidas, y los libros incluso son por lo general bastante feos.
And when books are actually published in Cuba, the print runs are generally small, the paper's not very good, the designs, I would say, are quite ugly.
Muchas veces un libro sale publicado por una editorial provincial de Santa Clara o de Holguín y ese libro nunca llega a La Habana.
Many times, books can be published by a publishing house based in Santa Clara or in Holguín, the far provinces, and may never reach Havana.
O es publicado por una editorial de La Habana y ese libro circula poco, mal o no circula. Hay ocasiones.
Or it's published in Havana, and then the book either gets around very poorly or never really is disseminated at all.
La edición hecha para Cuba, que yo gestioné de la novela Herejes, era una edición de 2.000 ejemplares y yo no creo que se hayan vendido ni 1.000 ejemplares.
The edition that was made especially for Cuba of Heretics was a print run of about 2,000, and I don't think even 1,000 of them
Los
were
otros 1000
sold.
no sé dónde están metidos,
I
si
have-
existen o no existen.
I have no idea what happened to the other 1,000, whether they exist or whether they don't exist. ¿Puedo decir una cosa? To give you an idea as well, I'm just going to add this. Somebody of Padura's renown who does publish outside of Cuba, 2,000, a print run of 2,000 is extraordinary. That is someone that has to be Leonardo Padura. The average Cuban who publishes in Cuba gets a print run of anywhere between 500 and 800. Maybe 1,000 if they won some kind of prize, and that's it. So to give you an idea of these numbers, and then when those editions are all sold, or half of them disappear, as Badura just said about his print run, they're just not available again. It's a very common thing to find, to meet writers who will tell you, I've published this and I've published that, and I'd love to give you a copy, but there are no more.
Y esto, el resultado que tiene es que pone en desventaja al escritor cubano con respecto al resto de los escritores latinoamericanos.
The result of this is that it really puts Cuban writers at a disadvantage vis-a-vis other Latin American writers.
Porque estamos hablando de una literatura que siempre, desde el siglo XIX, ha tenido una gran presencia internacional.
Because we're talking about a literature that since the 19th century has always had a great international presence.
Que ha tenido una cantidad importantísima de autores notables, poetas, narradores en lengua española.
A literature that had made a very important contribution in terms of numbers of poets, of novelists, of writers that are known outside of Cuba.
Pero las editoriales fuera de Cuba, como no ven que haya escritores que publiquen libros que tengan críticas, que tengan reseñas críticas, que tengan gran cantidad de lectores, pues les cuesta trabajo orientarse y saber cuál puede ser el escritor cubano con posibilidad de ser promovido.
But for publishing houses outside of Cuba now, it's very difficult for them to determine who could be a possible writer to bet on when there's a lack of critical reviews, when they don't really know what the number of readers are.
Y eso crea una situación muy compleja en cuanto a la visibilidad internacional, nacional e internacional de la literatura cubana.
And all of this conspires to create a very complex situation about both international visibility of Cuban literature and even national visibility of Cuban writers.
Lamentablemente, parecería que los últimos grandes escritores cubanos fueron Carpentier, Lezama Lima, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Reinaldo Arenas y poco más en el tiempo.
So sadly, what the impression would be is that the most recent Cuban writers are people like Alejo Carpentier, Lezama Lima, Reinaldo Arenas.
Y yo creo que hay una gran cantidad de escritores que viven dentro y fuera de la isla con condiciones, capacidad y obra para ser representativos de la literatura cubana.
But I think that there's a great quantity of writers writing both within Cuba and outside who have an enormous possibility of being representative of Cuban literature.
Porque, y con esto termino ya de responder la pregunta, creo que lo que sí se ha ganado en los últimos años ha sido la conciencia, no la conciencia, la firmeza de que se haya aceptado que los escritores cubanos vivan dentro o fuera de la isla, pertenecen a la cultura cubana, son escritores cubanos.
And with this, I'll conclude my answer. What I think has been gained in recent years is that there's a consciousness, or rather a solidity, to the idea that whether you're writing inside or outside of Cuba, you belong to Cuban literature and are a Cuban writer.
Porque hubo muchos años, varias décadas, en la que el hecho de estar dentro o fuera de la isla, una decisión que podía ser en primera o última instancia política, pero muchas veces era simplemente geográfica, determinaba supuestamente la pertenencia o no del escritor a la literatura cubana.
Because there were many years, many decades in which a decision to be living in or outside of Cuba, which could or could not be political, but could simply be geographic, was the deciding point of whether one was considered part of Cuban literature or not.
Y eso es un disparate desde todo punto de vista, porque justamente en lugares como los que estamos recorriendo en estos días, en esta ciudad,
And that, to me, is outrageous because when you think exactly of the types of places that we're going through in these specific days here,
estuvo el escritor cubano más universal, José Martí,
the most universal Cuban writer of all was here in this very place, José Martí,
que vivió más años de su vida en el exilio que en la isla.
who lived more of his life in exile than on the island itself.
Great. Do you want to talk about translation? I think we're okay, cool. I wonder, we just have a few more minutes, but I wonder if you could just talk about your, the process of translating, Padura, how you began working together, how you work together now.
Well, I do have some things to say about that, but I have so many other things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking,
Go
both
for
here
it.
on this stage and, you know, in our side conversations during the week, which I think fit into a little bit of that idea of translating, but also in the idea of what constitutes Caribbean culture, Cuban culture, and some of the things that I brought to Padura's work, but that he's told me about the kind of influences he's had. So to answer the translation part, one of the things I do want to say is that when I started working, when I read The Man Who Loved Dogs, I remember writing Padura a note and trying to tell him why I was the only person in the entire world who could possibly translate this book, because I had read a lot about the Spanish Civil War, and because I loved spy novels, and because I had studied briefly in Russia and could read Cyrillic, and so I could perfectly translate the transliterations from Cyrillic to Spanish back into English. And so I mounted this whole case of my kind of cultural upbringing and credits to help me render a book like The Man Who Loved Dogs into English. And I bring this up because one of the really interesting things about this week that we've been discussing is those cultural references that you have when you grow up in a given country, and how, as a Cuban American who grew up with Cuban parents, so many of the cultural markers that I found to be important in terms of reading people like Alejo Carpentier and Lezama Lima and José Martí, whose Zapaticos de Rosa I had to memorize when I was a child and recite every single January 28th on José Martí's birthday, were challenged when I started meeting people who had lived in Cuba in the years after which my parents had left, and the influences of Soviet literature, the influences of some of the work that Padura was telling me about Casa de las Américas in bringing writers from different countries in translation in Spanish. So it wasn't just a Cuban focus. And I just find that fascinating, the idea of these different cultural references that people from different generations in Cuba have as a result of being exposed to these institutional decisions by Casa de las Américas, Instituto Cubano del Libro. So I'd like to hear Padura speak a little bit about some of the influences of his work from non-Cuban writers, movies, music, etc., that you might not think Cubans listen to or enjoy.
Cuba es un país que tiene un grave problema con su autoestima.
Cuba has a real self-esteem problem.
Y es que los cubanos nos creemos que Cuba es mucho más grande que la isla, que Cuba esto es un continente.
This is because Cubans think that Cuba is much larger than an island. Cuba is a continent.
Y realmente, de las islas del Caribe, Cuba es la menos caribeña.
And of the islands of the Caribbean, Cuba is actually the least Caribbean.
Yo he tenido la posibilidad de visitar algunas islas del Caribe de lengua española, de lengua francesa, de lengua inglesa, y siento que estoy en el Caribe.
I've had the chance to visit other Caribbean islands, Anglophone, Francophone, and that's when I truly feel like I am in the Caribbean.
Y en Cuba creo que la sensación de pertenecer al Caribe es completamente diferente a la que existe, completamente no, es diferente a la que existe en las otras islas.
And I think that in Cuba, the feeling of belonging to the Caribbean is completely different than that of other islands in the Caribbean.
Los dos versos más famosos de la literatura cubana, uno es de José Martí.
The two most famous verses in Cuban literature, one of them is by José Martí,
En el que dice que el arroyo de la sierra me complace más que el mar, como si en Cuba tuviéramos el Himalaya y lo que tenemos son 4 lomitas en la parte oriental de Cuba.
So he says that the hills of the Sierra, the mountains of the Sierra, José Martí says, I find these more gratifying than the sea. And he writes this as if we were a country full of mountains when really there are 4 hills out in the east.
Y el otro es de Virgilio Piñera, donde habla de la maldita circunstancia del agua por todas partes.
And the other one is Virgilio Piñera's, the damned circumstance of being surrounded by water.
Como diciendo, pero qué desastre es este, es vivir en una isla, nosotros necesitamos más.
As if to say, what a disaster this is to live on an island. We need more.
De todas maneras, Cuba tiene una gran comunicación con las otras islas del Caribe, sobre todo en la música, en la danza y en las artes plásticas.
In any event, Cuba does have great links with other Caribbean islands, especially in music, dance, and arts. And the
Sin
arts.
embargo, en la literatura tiene una mirada que trata de ser definitivamente más europea o más norteamericana.
Nonetheless, in literature, Cuban literature tends to be more focused toward Europe and North America.
Y la mayoría de los escritores cubanos tenemos una gran comunicación con esos dos grandes universos culturales, literarios.
And the majority of Cuban writers, we have a kind of ongoing conversation with those two main literary traditions.
Con independencia, por supuesto, de los escritores de lengua española con los que yo tengo una relación de aprendizaje, de influencia.
Independent of Spanish language authors to whom I owe a great debt for having really taught me about writing.
En mi caso, como en el de otros autores cubanos, la literatura norteamericana, por ejemplo, ha sido una de las fuentes de inspiración, de conocimiento, de búsqueda de modelos.
In my case, as in those of other Cuban writers, North American literature has really served as a source of inspiration and to give us models.
Y afortunadamente, incluso en los momentos de mayor tensión política entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, se publicó en Cuba mucha literatura norteamericana.
And fortunately, even in the moments where there was the greatest tension between the United States and Cuba, there was a lot of North American literature being published in Cuba.
Yo he leído en ediciones cubanas A Hemingway, por supuesto, a Hemingway todo el mundo quiere robárselo.
And I've read in Cuban editions, I've read Hemingway, who everybody wants to plagiarize.
Pero leí a Faulkner, Cachon McCullers, Caldwell, Salinger, Scott Fitzgerald, es decir, la gran novela norteamericana del siglo XX la leí en ediciones cubanas.
So I've read Faulkner, Carson McCullers, Carver, F. Scott Fitzgerald, all of the great North American novels.
Aunque últimamente nos hemos quedado bastante desactualizados con respecto a la literatura que se hace en el resto del mundo y especialmente en los Estados Unidos.
Although lately I feel like we are a little bit behind in literature that's actually being written right now in the United States and in the rest of the world.
Y por eso cuando yo escribí el texto que titulé Yo quisiera ser Paul Auster,
So when I wrote the essay called I'd Like to Be Paul Auster,
tuve que explicarle después a muchísima gente quién era Paul Auster, porque en Cuba no lo conocían, no lo habían leído.
I had to explain to a lot of people in Cuba afterwards who Paul Auster was because a lot of people just didn't know.
Y eso es un poco también el reflejo de esa situación editorial de la que hablaba antes para los escritores cubanos, que también se cumple para los escritores de fuera de Cuba y su difusión en la isla.
And that is a bit of a reflection on the situation I was discussing earlier for Cuban writers. It's the same for editions that are published of foreign writers in Cuba.
Great. Well, I think we are sadly over time. But I want to really say I'm grateful to you both for that last sort of riff, because I think it's a great reminder that the conversation we're having here this weekend about Caribbeanness, Caribbean writing, you know, Havana has been an incredibly important node in that conversation for a long time. Key West has been an incredibly important node in various ways for discussing Cuba and Cubanness going way back. So please just join me in saying muchísimas gracias a Leonardo Padura, Ana Kushner, por su presencia y por sus libros también. Bueno, thank you.